For those who are coming in as guests, please just go ahead and put your name and the school you're representing in the chat so we can refer to each other or where you're just currently living and working right now. I think I really at this point have met all of you, but my name is Kayla Edwards. I'm the outreach assistant at the Pulitzer Center. I reminded our panelists that we will be recording this session and likely posting online and other social media channels. And I'm excited to introduce you all to today's panel, which is titled Gender Equality. Again, we're encouraging everyone to tweet, and you can tweet along with us using the hashtag Pulitzer Weekend 21. And before we get started, I would also like to just introduce and give a big thank you and shout out to members of the Pulitzer Center team in this session today, including Catherine Josie, who's the producer of the session, and Daniel Vasta, who will be live tweeting. I'm glad that Kem is also here today and will definitely be participating with questions and lots of great feedback. So we do have an icebreaker to get us started today, so I'm interested in any comments in the chat and maybe one or two people who'd like to share out loud, which is, where are you most looking forward to traveling for work or for pleasure post-pandemic? I can get started. I'm really hoping to see my roommate from college at some point soon, and she lives on the West Coast in Colorado. I guess the West, not the coast.
I would say traveling anywhere outside of the Dakotas. I've been in the Dakotas for such a long time.
In the chat, it looks like people are hoping to get to Greece. Maybe one more, anyone?
I want to have my Mamma Mia moment, you know?
Yes.
I'm hoping to get to Australia.
Oh, cool. Oregon, California, South Africa. These are all great places. Thank you all for thinking of them and sharing them, and we can all dream together of a time when we maybe can all meet there for a future reunion. So with that, I'd like to just go ahead and introduce today's speakers and the projects that they will be presenting. We'll start off with Callie Cox, who is a reporting fellow from Southern Illinois University, Carbondale, who will share the project Perils of Mexican LGBTQ+ and Transgender Migrants in Texas. Ren Murphy, a reporting fellow from South Dakota State University, will be presenting the project Transflight, the lived experiences of transgender South Dakotans. Valerie Perez from LaGuardia Community College will be presenting the project LGBTQI Refugees Find Shelter and Support in Greece. Adriana Rosas Rivera from Syracuse University's SI Newhouse School of Public Communications will be presenting the project Demystifying Menstruation in Puerto Rico. Rachel Sorcher will be presenting Pregnant and Giving Birth Healthcare for TNB Populations, and Rachel is from Boston University's School of Public Health. And then finally, Ruby Zhao of Davidson College will be presenting The Buried Her Story of Comfort Women. I will note that we have 6 presenters today, so while this is our last presentation, we will want to be aware of time so that we have enough time to also get to Q&A and let everyone enjoy the rest of their weekends. So we'll start with a short presentation followed by discussion. Please put your name in the chat as we've been doing throughout the weekend if you have a question, and we'll call on you after we've heard from each of our 6 speakers. And do take notes so that you remember what you'd like to ask. And with that, I will turn it over to Callie to get us started.
Okay, hi everyone. I'd like to apologize in advance for any hiccups. My fear of public speaking ranks up there with spiders. So with that, my name's Callie. For about 2 weeks this summer, my reporting partner, Angel Chevris, and I visited El Paso, Texas, to report on the challenges facing LGBTQ+ asylum seekers and to highlight the lack of government support they receive, the dangers they face, and the network of grassroots support that has formed to help them survive and succeed in the immigration process. I was the writer on the project, and he took the photos. In order to highlight this network, we focused on telling the stories of 2 shelters that house trans asylum seekers on their journey. Casa de Colores, located in Ciudad Juarez, Mexico, and Casa Carmelita in El Paso, Texas. Casa de Colores was a broken down, abandoned hotel in downtown Juarez that became home to 45 trans women who were stuck in the city because of Title 42 and Remain in Mexico policies, and who weren't welcome or safe in other shelters. Here they found a chosen family that accepted them. They were able to dress and be however they wanted. They made friends, they celebrated Christmas and birthdays, and they built a community they ran themselves. In order to cross the border, the women of Casa de Colores had to rely on a network of grassroots organizations and local activists who provided them and other shelters along the border with the support they needed to survive. This is where Casa Carmelita, which I'll talk about a little bit later, came into play. Before I can tell you about some of the characters and their stories, I need to highlight some of the problems they faced as they attempted to immigrate to the US. So about 4,385 LGBTQ plus people sought asylum in the US between 2007 and 2017, and 1,228 of these individuals filed specific claims based on persecution regarding their sexual orientation or gender identity. These numbers may be higher, but they often go underreported. They often face discrimination in employment, housing, and healthcare, and this can lead to an increase in violence, murder, and sexual assault in their home countries. The Remain in Mexico policies in Title 42 are devastating for LGBTQ plus asylum seekers, and especially for those who are trans. Mexico has the second highest rate of transphobia-related crimes in all of Latin America, and often these go unreported or not classified as transphobic as well. Asylum seekers in El Paso are also often expelled in the middle of the night, often around 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. in red light districts, according to Title 42 policies, putting them at a higher risk of sexual violence, sexual assault, and human trafficking. Casa de Colores is pictured on the slide you see on the screen. It was founded by Susie and Alexa, two best friends seeking asylum from El Salvador, who fled one shelter because of the treatment they faced there and were later kicked out of another shelter with a religious affiliation. They cleaned up animal feces, fixed the electricity, and hauled water because the plumbing didn't work from a local bar for over 20 days to make this place their home. They slowly welcomed more trans and LGBTQ asylum seekers until eventually 45 people were living in the building. The area where the building is located is surrounded by bars, and when I took a walk in the alley behind it, I noticed needles littering the ground. The graffiti you see on the back says "Mi cuerpo, mi decisión," my body, my decision, or my body, my choice in English, and "Mi quiero viva," I want to live. There's also other artwork that's not pictured here portraying women who were murdered due to femicide, and the pink crosses that symbolize femicide. These are 4 of the women we interviewed during our time there who crossed the border from Juarez to El Paso and who were living at Casa Carmelita when we arrived. The first woman I want to introduce you to is Susie. She's from El Salvador and is referred to as the mom of the group. She took care of everyone and has so many skills she put to use in both Casa de Colores and Casa Carmelita. She's a skilled construction worker. She has talents with electricity, plumbing, and even drove big rigs through the mountains of Latin America. She hopes to be reunited with her high school age son, who's currently living in Minnesota, and someday with her 1-year-old baby daughter, who's still in El Salvador with her other mom. As she awaits sponsorship, she still works to help others find asylum in the US. She has 3 phones she uses for this and multiple computer screens. She spends hours each day on the phone with those hoping to find safety in the US, connecting them with resources, helping them with paperwork. She also makes sure to check in with the other 44 women from Casa de Colores who have since crossed the border. The next woman I want to introduce you to is Alexa. She's also from El Salvador and is Susie's best friend. She left the country because of discrimination she faced in education and employment. She was kicked out of school where she was learning to become a teacher because she refused to cut her hair, and then later fired from a job when her boss found out she was trans. She helped to found Casa de Colores and was known as the emotional support of the group. She's known for being happy and light and is one of the youngest among everyone who came across the border. She's also a big Game of Thrones and Umbrella Academy fan on Netflix. Vicky was a sex worker in Tijuana for 20 years before she was forced to flee because of narco violence in the area. She went to a shelter that became abusive and exploitative to her and other LGBTQ individuals who were living in that shelter, and then she found Casa de Colores and finally Casa Carmelita in El Paso. She's the best cook and makeup artist of the group. This is Brisa. She never stayed at Casa de Colores and instead met the others at Casa Carmelita when Susie helped her find a place to stay after she came out of ICE detention. She faced sexual violence in Juarez at the hands of both the cartels and the police, and she faced discrimination in the maquiladores, which are basically sweatshops run by American companies just across the border. She worked there for several years. I have a quote from her here that says she never had what most people refer to as the American dream, and she didn't want to leave Mexico. She said, I felt good in Mexico, but I lived in a time where the same criminals made me too scared. I was never afraid. I used to say I was not afraid of death, but there comes a time when you start to see. That's when you start to get scared. They begin to threaten me. That's where the quote ends, and that's when she said she decided to flee the country. Next up is Juan Ortiz, one of the founders of Casa Carmelita. Juan is what he calls a fronterizo, someone who grew up on both sides of the US-Mexico border. He grew up on the poverty line like many in El Paso, but still gives everything he has to everyone else and supports so many different shelters and groups in the area. He drives supplies across the border, sometimes multiple times a week, and even continued to do so after being severely injured and beaten in a hate crime. In addition to his physical volunteer work, he's a graduate student and already has a master's degree. And he's a talented artist who creates political murals about immigration around the city. Then we have Brian Seavey, a pastor of the local Metropolitan Community Church. Brian was the first gay pastor many of the women from Latin America met, which is a huge deal for so many who were driven out of their homes because of religious prejudice. And he was also one of the first activists to become involved with Casa de Colores and connect them with Casa Carmelita, Cosecha, and other resources and networks that helped them get across the border. He would make trips multiple times a week to visit them, shop for them, and to provide support. I can say so much more about all of these characters, but we're short on time, so you'll have to read the articles when they come out because they are truly amazing people who, despite their personal challenges, still reach out to help others. I want to explain a little bit more about the network that worked to support Casa de Colores. So after Brian became involved and informed Casa Carmelita that Casa de Colores needed help with supplies and support, activists jumped in. MCC became involved through Brian. Casa Carmelita started working with other shelters to provide support from the Juarez side network, complete repairs on the building. The Santa Fe Dreamers Project began helping with legal support, paperwork, and sponsorship. And Cosecha, a national group which works closely with Casa Carmelita, began to help with fundraising and also drove supplies across the border. These trips across the border aren't a small thing. At times, the Border Patrol will try to seize the donations or apply heavy taxes to anything brought across. The trip can also take several hours because of the lines to get through security and can be an all-day thing. But overall, because of the support of these groups, the women had food to eat, their paperwork was processed, allowing them to cross the border in May to seek sponsors. They did all of this with no government support or aid. So what happens next? Now the women are awaiting sponsorship and 4 are left at Casa Carmelita. They're having their claims processed, and in the meantime, activists at the border are still working to support other asylum seekers and are not seeing an increase in any government aid. And Susie's continuing her work of supporting LGBTQ migrants and the women of Casa de Colores. They're also seeing an increase in support across the nation and the community, and people as far as grandmas in Alaska have sent Casa Carmelita quilts, and they've created several mutual aid networks to provide support without government help. But that's all I have for now.
Thank you so much, Callie. And I just wanted to borrow words from the Pulitzer Center's K through 12 team when they're presenting to educators and also students that our #1 goal is to take care of ourselves and each other. And just knowing that the rest of the presentation today will touch on themes of violence and the experience of refugees. I just want to encourage everyone that if you need to take a moment, if you need to grab some water, turn off your camera, do a little stretch, please do that. We are here again to take care of ourselves and each other, but also share these really impactful and important stories. And so with that, I will turn to Ren for our second presentation.
You found it.
Ren, I think you might be muted.
Okay, there it is. I don't think I'm muted anymore.
No, we can hear you.
Okay, so my project is called Transflight, the lived experience of trans South Dakotans. And the reason that I got interested in this topic was, well, one, I am a trans person who lived in South Dakota up until I got a job in North Dakota. And South Dakota over the past couple of years has seen a lot of different bills aimed at limiting the rights of trans people, especially trans minors. Bathroom bills, limitations on healthcare, that sort of thing. And a lot of people that I know have want to leave the state functionally. And I wanted to see if that was a more widespread thing. And I'd seen on the internet, there's a very common perception of South Dakota as a hellhole for LGBTQ people. And I wanted to talk to as many people and see what their actual lived experiences were like. And another reason that I was interested in this was rural areas have a lot of trouble keeping young people, and a lot of, and LGBTQ people, a lot of them are pretty young and are worried about their safety in the state. And so some leave because of that. And so that's why I wanted to look into this topic a little bit more in depth. So the main questions that I wanted to ask are, what are people's actual lived experiences? Do they feel like the legislation is an accurate reflection of the culture of the state? And how do their experiences as trans people living in South Dakota in rural areas affect their future prospects? Are they going to stay in the state, or do they think they have no future here? So some of the big challenges was building connections and navigating difficult topics. This was both the easiest and the hardest part. There were some interviews that I really wanted. I worked really hard to try to get it, and it didn't end up happening. And I also had to talk about a lot of very difficult subjects with people who were a lot younger than me, with like 14, 15, 16-year-olds, and talking about suicide, talking about mental health, talking about bullying and assault and abuse. You have to tread pretty lightly, especially when you're talking with kids. But it was actually eventually it was pretty easy to build connections. One reason is because I'm a trans person living in South Dakota, and it's such a small community that a lot of my friends recommended me to other people or introduced me, and that added a layer of trustworthiness. They knew that I wasn't just a national reporter that was going to drop in, report on like just trauma and just tragedy, and then leave. They knew that I was someone who was invested in the topic and cared about what they had to say. And then finding a narrative and making sure that I checked my bias, that was another thing. If I have confidence, I can remove a lot of my political opinions from my reporting, but it's always something I'm very aware of, especially when I'm so connected with the issue. And what people said, the experiences were so broad, and there is no universal experience to build a story around. And so eventually I had to start changing my angle, like little by little. And the eventual like main focus, I would say, is this legislation. How does it affect people? Not the legislation itself, but the knowledge that this legislation comes back year after year. How does that affect them? And does it reflect, does that national attention from the media about these bills actually reflect what their experiences are? And this also helped me separate myself from any political biases, just because I don't talk about specific legislation. So I don't have, and again, like I trust myself to remove it, but it's just an extra little safeguard. And so eventually I talked to a lot of people, and I apologize for my webcam. It's not very good. The people I talked to had a very wide range of experiences. Some people had left the state and had grown up here. Some were teenagers, and so obviously didn't have much choice. And then some people were actually adults who had moved to South Dakota for work in some cases, or just because they wanted a change of pace. One person was actually fleeing an abusive environment in Mississippi. And some had known that they were trans when coming here, and some had not. And a lot of the people were pretty conflicted about whether they wanted to stay or not. It really depended on if some types of legislation passed, and if they got the support that they needed from their communities. The teenagers were the most conflicted out of all of them. But one thing that was pretty nice to talk about was just to talk about their plans about, traveling the state, because they're just teenagers and they want to have a normal teen experience. And being trans is part of that, but they don't want it to define what their life looks like. And but things that were pretty consistent. All the teenagers had problems with bullying at some point, some worse than others, some physical violence and some mostly verbal. Mental health was a big concern for everyone that I interviewed, and like drug use and other sensitive topics, those came up a lot. The lack of resources was another big problem, like lack of access to health care, lack of access to just a support network. There are only 3 doctors in the entire state that will prescribe hormone therapy, and it used to just be 1. And it's a pretty big state, so it wasn't accessible for a lot of people. A lot thought that the legislation and the national opinion on South Dakota didn't actually reflect their experiences, that living in the state was actually a lot more complicated than, oh, the evil government, is trying to limit rights. No, it was. There are some politicians I disagree with that are vocal, but I don't think their opinions reflect the people that I've met. And so I'm just going to end this with a couple different quotes just to kind of demonstrate how varied people's opinions were. This is Chris Hartzler. He is a former resident of South Dakota. He moved soon after graduation for mental health reasons. And then these are some of the things he said to me. For a long time, to me, it was you leave or you end up in the ground. And I was so proud of the things Brookings had done. That's his university town. And I was devastated when it went red. It shattered me. I hit the burnout and left the state. Some folks hit the burnout and don't wake up the next day. It really is chasing people out of the state. Then someone who had a very different experience was Dr. Amy Bedient. They are a gender fluid doctor who lives in a town of less than 2,000 people and is one of the 3 doctors at the hospital. And they are very open with all of their patients about their identity, and they try to be as open as possible about it to everyone. And they also have a lot of trans patients, like trans patients will connect each other to that doctor because they feel more comfortable. They said, I'm probably the only trans person they'll ever meet. It shows people we're not weird, we're not scary. That's why I think it's important. It's not a secret. There's a lot of loud voices that say, we hate you, and why can't I be loud about loving people? And then, like I've mentioned several times, there were several teenagers I talked to. One, Kieran, was 15 years old, and actually his interview was probably the one that meant the most to me. It wasn't the most emotionally impactful, but his parent actually said something to me that was probably the most meaningful thing, was, I don't trust journalists to stay with my kid when I'm not there, but they trusted me to do it. They trusted me to know boundaries, know limits, and to treat the situation with empathy and not like I was just dropping in to exploit it. And so and eventually this parent took the other kid to a soccer practice, and then I just stayed in the restaurant with Kieran and talked to him. And he said, I didn't know much about legislation in middle school and elementary school, but I knew it was happening and some people were being hurt by it. It's still a constant fear. If this legislation comes out, what am I going to have to change about my life, or what I'm going to have to change about me? That was something that concerned him a lot. And then Aaron had a quite different experience. Obviously, they had been bullied, but their experiences had been a lot more mixed, and they were not sure what they wanted to do. And they said, I feel like people outside of South Dakota probably assume that it's like some sort of hellhole we're dying to escape from. And maybe some people feel like that, but it's not terrible. I like it here. I like the open spaces. The people can be nice. I want to try living in other places, I think, but I wouldn't be surprised if I ended up coming back. And that's about all that I have. This is Aaron. We met at a truck stop gas station, and but there were some nice flowers growing by. So yeah, looking forward to hearing the rest of your presentations.
Thank you so much, Ren. And next we'll have Valerie present.
Thank you. We're good. So hi everyone, I'm Valerie. Last year, I was, on the beginning of this year to 2021, I was at LaGuardia Community College in New York City, where I got a degree in associates in journalism. And that is where, I have to say this because I'm very grateful, Professor Fox came to me and suggested that I submit a project that I had spoken to her about. And now I am at Columbia University pursuing a degree in film and media studies. I'm thrilled to be here. It's a bit tricky for me, this presentation, because I haven't done the reporting trip yet. So bear with what I can tell you for now. The title of my project is Off Track: LGBTQI Refugees Find Shelter and Support in Greece. And the planned reporting trip will be spring of 22. So before I move forward, let me take you back a minute. So if you recall that in 2015, due to the Syrian civil war, there was an overwhelming, one of the largest migration waves out of Syria, mostly, but that generated a whole new wave of migration. The main point of entry to anywhere in Europe was Greece. So the map that I'm sharing here is, I pulled from Reuters. It is a map of 2015 that shows the situation that was going on in 2015. And in this particular crisis, it really happened basically within 6 months. The situation went from the regular crisis that the region has to something never seen before. And the migration waves were trying to move into Europe through not only mainland, but islands as well. And one of the main points that became a reference that I'm sure everyone heard of at some point was Lesbos, right? So that's just to situate. This is a very distorted map of that map, but it really does show that all the roads lead to, not Rome in this case, but Athens and islands. So that got me thinking, right? I was actually at the time working as a freelance producer in documentary production for international productions, and I began researching this topic and following closely. I'm very interested in topics of refugee populations. In the case of LGBTQI, you're talking about doubly marginalized populations, and sometimes even more, because all of these groups of people are fleeing violence of various types. It can be a civil war, it can be religious, it all boils down to gender, and most of them come from Africa, Middle East, and Southeast Asia. And many of these countries, same-sex relations are still criminalized to the point of punishment. It's not only shame or bad, you will be in prison and you might die. You can be executed also, right? While I was researching around 2019, that I began digging deeper into this, 2018, 2019, I came across a name. I began reading about this shelter in Greece called Safe Place International, and that shelter was opened by the philanthropist Justin Hilton. He resides in California, and what caught my eye was it had a very interesting kind of operational model. The way he approached, he opened a shelter. First of all, he opened a shelter for LGBTQI folks in Greece, in Athens, and in Lesbos. It was the only one, it is still the only LGBTQI shelter in Greece. And what caught my attention, the more I read, the more I dug in, was that he and his team approaches the refugee reality, not as a crisis, but as a reality that is there to stay. So it's not how do you, how are we going to taper this crisis, is how do we manage this on a constant basis, because this is going to repeat itself. It might increase at some points and might decrease in others, but he sees it, he doesn't consider it a specific crisis, it's an ongoing crisis, right? So this operational model that I call it, worked very closely with the aid and advocacy directly with refugees. When I started looking into all other agencies and organizations, local and global, there is less work. There are many players between the aid and the refugee, right? So that is what caught my attention. That is what drew me into the story. Safe Place International has 33 shelters in 7 different countries. So they're well established. Justin Hilton has been doing this for over 20 years. And I began researching that too. Right now they have shelters in these locations, mainly the Middle East. Also, he spent some time in India, South Africa, and Central America. Another thing that caught my attention about Safe Place International was that they are in part funded by US and global organizations. Some of them are listed here: Omran, the Rising Foundations, some international corporations. And what definitely I found very interesting is that they also partnered with universities and colleges. So one of them, for example, is Adelphi University. So I began seeing this. Why is this guy having, and the success, and then the cherry on the cake was over 90% of the people who go through his shelters move on, are working in local economies, or have moved into another, were relocated successfully, are studying, are working. So within a very complicated situation and often tragic reality, there are actually positive outcomes, or at least a more hopeful outcome. And that was very interesting to me. So that is my project. I'm looking into, actually, let me go here. Would this operate? The questions that I wanted to bring up is, would the operational model succeed that SPI has succeeded with other organizations, right? Including major organizations like the UN. And was the successful operational model equally successful for and beneficial to the refugees, right? How did that operational model translate directly to them? My project is a multimedia social documentary project. It has photography and writing. It is investigative journalism, and I'll be traveling on my own. So a bit of the pre-reporting that I've done is I've had several conversations with Justin Hilton over Zoom. He's very excited for this project. With the team I've spoken, I attended a couple of fundraising events. He has some star power that supports his Safe Place International. I also had a few interviews, 3 or 4 interviews with refugees located in Athens and Lesbos. I'm doing research with it, still seeing what has happened since 2015. And I also connected, which has been very helpful, with local folks here in New York. Some people who actually were in Greece and made it to the US, and I've been getting their feedback. Now, this is actually one of the refugees with whom I spoke with over Zoom. I would like to see the story published in a major US or global publication, right? However, I even mentioned this in a session earlier today. I'm very, very interested in seeing this story published locally. And I'm connecting and doing research with potential partners. So challenges and complications. Let's get into, right? COVID. COVID initially slowed them down, SBI and the whole operation, and then later literally shut them down. I'm not even going to get into this, really dramatic, because these people really depend on this to live, right, to survive, many of them. And this the COVID domino effect was really tragic. Then came more recently the withdrawal of Afghanistan, the US forces in Afghanistan, which created a new wave of LGBTQI refugees. I'm just throwing these complications out there. I have to handle them gradually. I also find it a bit challenging that my main, the person who helps me actually move this story forward is is Justin Hilton. So I'm very dependent on him. I can't move it's fine, but I'm just saying it is a challenge because I have to walk with him. I can try to steer it, the pace of this, but there's only so much I can do. There's no one else to turn to right now because I'm not there. Not being able to visit locations, right? And sitting down and going, spending time, that thing that I'm used to, oh, let me just stay here, we'll just follow you, right? Confidentiality and anonymity is a big issue, but we'll handle that too. And another issue that's very challenging, and I hadn't thought of this beforehand because I didn't know, but within the LGBTQI global population, they have personal biases and prejudices, right? You have people who are coming from Africa, who are sharing a space with people who are coming from the Middle East. Those are completely different realities. The fact what they have in common at sometimes is not enough to overcome the differences. Most of the time it is. I think that's actually interesting. So that is my project. And this is me. So remember, off track, LGBTQI refugees find shelter and support in Greece. And I am very excited to produce this. And I am very grateful to the Pulitzer Center.
Thank you, Valerie. We look forward to when you're actually able to travel and report on this story. Next, we'll have Adriana presenting.
Hi, everyone. All right, let me share my screen. You guys see that? We're good? Awesome. Hi, everyone. So I'm Adriana. I am the reporting fellow for Syracuse University. And my project is demystifying menstruation in Puerto Rico. And this photo was taken at a menstrual exhibition in Atorrey, Puerto Rico, which I'll talk about a little bit later. So just some quick facts before we jump into the actual project. Puerto Rico is a US colony in the Caribbean. People think of it as this, as an international thing, but no, we're a 2.5-hour flight from Miami. The population has been in decline recently. So we're at 3.1 million, but it declined about 11% in the last census, that's what it said. And there's 43.5% of people living in poverty. And so 2 key terms to know about my project or for my project. The first one is period poverty, and you probably have heard of this one before. So that's just the inability to afford tampons, pad, menstrual cups, anything that is related to managing your period. And then menstrual injustice, which is something I learned on this project. Margaret E. Johnson, who is a researcher at, I believe she's at the University of Delaware. I'm blanking on the name right now, but menstrual injustice is the oppression of menstruators, women, girls, transgender men and boys, and non-binary persons simply because they menstruate. So this can include just bias against someone because they menstruate. This includes education gaps. This includes period poverty as well. It covers any issue that is related to menstruation. So how I got my story idea, I really wanted to focus on Puerto Rico. I wasn't really sure what traveling was going to look like for the summer because of COVID, and I am Puerto Rican, born and raised. So I knew if there was a place I could safely quarantine, it's at home. So I wanted to focus on my island. And then I just asked people, Like, what do you want to listen to? What do you want to read? What do you think you don't see in the news? And a couple people mentioned period poverty in Africa. And that got me thinking, okay, well, what's the situation in Puerto Rico? So that's where I started asking myself, okay, is there period poverty in PR? Like in other places across the world? What about other menstrual issues tied to receiving care for endometriosis? What about young menstruating individuals in schools? And I'm sorry, there's a train. I'm going right by my apartment. What about education? Like it's such a taboo issue. Are they receiving proper education on what menstruation is and how to manage it? So that's where I got into some challenges in my reporting. My challenges started even before I pitched this to the Pulitzer Center. I really thought I was going to find these numbers that were going to say X% of people don't have access to tampons on the island, or X% of people haven't heard the word menstruation before the age of 11. There is no data like that on the island. There's very little data. So we don't know how many people can't afford menstrual products. We don't know how many people have had incomplete menstrual education. We don't know how many people have been the subject of some sort of bias because they menstruate. So we can make estimates though. And there is one reporter on the island who has actually covered menstrual issues. She's the only one, and she's covered it for a very small digital platform on the island called Todas PR. And she wrote, using census data, that the group of Black women living in poverty account for nearly half of the poverty rate. So this is not just a gender issue, it's a racial issue as well. That this could be affecting people of color more deeply than it's affecting the rest of the island. Another challenge was relearning what I knew about menstruation. So like I said, I didn't know what menstrual justice was until I started talking to my sources, and they said, okay, well, period poverty, it goes beyond that. There's other issues tied to menstruation. And also period poverty puts the weight of the issue on the menstruator. It's really just poverty. It's a social justice issue. So kind of switching my framing, that took some work. I also felt weird reporting about a topic that I've been told to never talk about. All of us who are menstruating individuals, you're taught to hide your pad, you're taught to not talk about this. It's something that's embarrassing. So I had to get over that sense and just talk to my sources freely, like they talked freely to me about the topic. And then shifting my story, I started thinking, okay, I'm going to have this huge story that's going to uncover these numbers. I'm going to show that there's period poverty on the island. That's not what I ended up reporting. And special thanks to Melissa Noel, my advisor, who said, you know what? I think your story is the lack of data. Like, I think the story is the trouble you're having. Why aren't there numbers? There's numbers in the US. Why aren't there numbers for Puerto Rico? It's a US colony. Why aren't there numbers? So that's my main story. And so here's a little look at the menstrual exhibition I went to. It's called Cíclica, which means just cycle. And it was hosted in a low-income neighborhood in Puerto Rico by a woman called Lorangelis Tomas Negron. She is a menstrual activist, and the exhibition consisted of 40 artists who used their menstrual blood to make these paintings. I had never seen anything like this, had never thought of anything like this, but to them, using their menstrual blood to paint and to create art was a process for healing. Like, this is how they heal against the heal from the injustices that are perpetrated against them because they're menstruating individuals. So there was food. You can see it in the third from the left. There was food. They were selling jewelry. It was, this whole thing. And then inside the house, they exhibited the paintings. And then there were also workshops. So this was also an educational thing. There were workshops for young people, which is what I went to. So there was a 5-year-old, there were tweens, there were teenagers, and they were getting comprehensive, inclusive menstrual education. I had never seen anything like it. The environment was comfortable. Nobody was ashamed to talk about it. At one point, one of my sources handed out papers and pencils and told the young people in the room to draw a vulva. And the 5-year-old had the best one. She just had such talent for drawing, and they were teaching them how to identify parts of the female body through those drawings. So it was a really interesting thing to witness. And so the final product, I ended up with a 1,600 word main article. Kem said 1,200 words, but I accidentally added like 400 more. And that article focused on, the lead was the lack of data, but using voices, using my sources to tell why I needed, why we need to talk about this, like using different people to share what their injustices were. So was it the lack of education? Was it the lack of care for your endometriosis? I also did a 9-minute podcast episode, kind of a recap of that article. And then in the process of pitching both of those, if anybody has suggestions on where to pitch, let me know. And I did a field note, which published this last Wednesday, and it's about how I had to reframe the story. And actually, oh, I skipped this slide entirely, sorry. And quickly, just to run you through my sources, my actual reporting, like I said, I was expecting to focus on period poverty, but I ended up focusing on the range of menstrual injustices and on specific people. So you can see my cursor. This is Diana. She was my main source. She's a menstrual therapist. This is Joanna. And this is Laura Angelis. She was the one who put together the exhibition. And both Joanna and Laura Angelis run social media accounts with about a couple thousand. I think Joanna has like 8,000 followers. And through those social media accounts, they do a lot of their menstrual education. So a lot of these people are doing community work, and this is how they know about those menstrual injustices. Laura Angelis particularly, she is a Black, queer, HIV positive person. And so her injustice was she didn't know how to manage her menstruation being HIV positive. So her experience was really interesting because she was saying, I was scared. I was scared because my blood is potentially dangerous to someone else. So that really, her story kind of was for me, it really showed the range of injustices that people experience. So I talked to an endometriosis expert on the island. I talked to these 3 wonderful people, the menstrual journalist, menstrual therapist. But again, there aren't really any scientists who will give you hard numbers on this. So my story really elevates community voices instead of focuses on specific numbers. And that is it for me. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. And next we'll hear from Rachel.
How do I stop sharing? Oh, down here. Sorry about that. There you go.
All right, let me share my screen. Can everybody see? All right. Perfect, thank you. All right, hello everybody. My name is Rachel and I'm a 2nd-year Master of Public Health student at BU. And I've been reporting virtually on transgender family building and pregnancy care. I'm still in the reporting process, but I'm excited to have the opportunity to share with you today what I've learned so far and how my story has taken shape. And I just want to thank Kem Libby and the Pulitzer Center for providing me with my first journalism opportunity. And before we begin, I also want to note that all of my interviewees gave me permission to share their pictures and story today with you. So I came into this experience with a commitment to health equity and interest in pregnancy care, but I came across this topic specifically after talking to a maternal health researcher at BU who is deeply concerned with the lack of respectful care research happening around the transgender population. And I realized that this gap in research mirrors the lack of non-sensationalized media we see around transgender pregnancy. So as an ally of the LGBTQIA+ community, but not a member myself, I knew that whatever form this story took, it had to be led by transgender and non-binary voices. So in the same spirit, I thought today I would allow the stories of some of those who I've interviewed to contextualize the obstacles that transgender people may face in the family building process and the essential work of transgender healthcare providers of all kinds. So I'll start off by sharing an anecdote from JB that really gets to the heart of my reporting so far. JB is a full spectrum doula and educator, director of Love Over Fear, Wellness and Birth, and program director of birth advocacy doula trainings. They're also a transgender masculine person. JB had an abortion as a teen, which made them the point person in their community for providing support when others went through the same thing. Their passion for providing this type of support really formalized when they started doula training as an adult and just fell in love with it. So JB described to me how there are not a lot of reproductive health resources that are reflective of the queer trans experience. So through client care and education initiatives, they're trying to provide an answer to this and respond to the needs of their community. As we talked, they explained that the normalization of prejudice and discrimination against queer people in dominant culture is reflected in the very curriculum that are used to train medical professionals. So this means that there are very few medical programs, nursing schools, or midwifery programs that teach about queer trans experiences. And this impacts what providers know, what they don't know, and most importantly, how people are actually treated in the care systems. In this same vein, there's a lack of funding for trans reproductive health. So there's a gap in fertility preservation counseling, a lot of misinformation about the impact of gender affirming hormone therapies or surgeries on current and future reproductive health as well. So JB is just one example of how transgender healthcare providers of all kinds are helping others in the community to navigate building a family in a system that wasn't made for them. And not just that, but advocating truly for the celebration of families of all kinds. The importance of transgender and non-binary healthcare providers such as JB simply cannot be overstated. Nearly 1 in 5 transgender and gender non-conforming people report being outright refused care, 28% report being harassed in medical settings, and 50% of respondents in one study reported having to teach their medical provider about transgender care. So all of these obstacles and many more lead at least 28% of transgender and gender non-conforming people to delay care, leaving them vulnerable to many physical, emotional, and mental health challenges. Tristan, he's father of 3 and founder of Trans Fertility Co., an online support hub for transgender individuals in the family building process, and a gay trans man himself, knows these obstacles all too well. For example, when pregnant, Tristan was unable to schedule a prenatal visit because the insurance wouldn't allow males to schedule in the system. And after slipping and falling on the ice while pregnant, a clinic nurse didn't believe he was the patient for his ultrasound. So he and his 9-year-old kid had to convince the nurse that he was in fact pregnant in front of the entire waiting room. Tristan now uses these experiences and others to inspire his work as a health consultant to advocate for queer health rights across the country. But because of his experience in being one of the internet's first pregnant men, he takes specific care in working with transgender individuals to find competent reproductive care providers, providing truthful sources on fertility preservation, lactation, and IVF, and helping trans people to find ways to comfortably enter traditionally held cis women spaces like prenatal yoga classes. So in Tristan's experience, after reading about the many benefits of prenatal yoga, he found a class and emailed the instructor saying, "I'm a transgender man, I'm pregnant, and if you prefer your class to be a safe space for women only, I respect that, but if I'm welcome, I would love to come." So Shauna, the prenatal yoga instructor, she's also a doula and childbirth educator, welcomed Tristan, and she really got to work ensuring that her class was a welcoming space for all of her students. So she wrote to people, read tons of articles, and talked with trans friends who had babies. This process, she said, brought a whole other level of looking at her classroom practices as well as her studios and seeing what she could do better. So she changed her gendered language in class and revisited scenarios she would read to make them gender inclusive. But she told me that this learning process didn't stop there. She is on a continuous learning journey to make herself more aware of her positionality in the world and how she can improve in her allyship. Having Tristan come to her prenatal yoga class was helpful beyond a professional sense, because one day her son's friend, who's transgender, came to her asking about transgender pregnancy and what his experience might be like in building a family. So Shauna then went on to tell me that she was grateful for her experience in finding ways to support Tristan and his health, so that when this kid came to her and asked questions, she could answer with what she knew, but she also knew how to find correct information elsewhere. So this is just one example of the fact that you don't have to be trans to be a good healthcare provider for trans people. We have to be willing to put in the work and understand the needs of the community. So the last story I want to share is that of Adam, a father, former special education teacher, assistant principal, and trans man. Adam is an example of the good that can come from providers doing their research, being open to difficult conversations, and being willing to change to make their practices inclusive. So Adam grew up in rural Ohio, but he was lucky to have an accepting family who has supported him throughout his whole life and his transition, but he knows that is not the reality for many trans people. He always envisioned himself being a parent, but he didn't know exactly how that would or could happen. This changed when he met his wife, Sophie, and decided to transition. Living in the Bay Area, Adam had access to reproductive care through UCSF, who are a leader in trans health. And knowing that he wanted a biological connection to his child, but he didn't want to carry the baby, he and Sophie decided to undergo reciprocal IVF. And in order to do so, they had to save up for years. For example, while planning their wedding, they started putting aside money for the process. Instead of having 2 cars, they had 1. And Adam worked Instacart after his 9-to-5 job to save extra money. So after all of this, Adam underwent IVF, and this process was emotionally, mentally, and physically exhausting for him. He had to go off of testosterone during the process, heightening his sense of gender dysphoria. But one thing that he noted that really helped him through was the great compassion and respect that he was met with from his provider team and their competency in trans health. So he was addressed with the right pronouns. His doctor didn't second guess his ability to provide as a parent. And if he ever felt uncomfortable, his team really addressed the issue straight away. So this positive experience was integral in Adam and Sophie's family building process. Now they have a 2-year-old son, Miles, who they named after the resilient journey that it took to bring him into the world. Now that Miles is born, Adam's been able to undergo a hysterectomy and other trans-related surgeries. So the stories I've shared with you today are among the many that I've learned through my reporting so far. But looking forward, I plan to talk to more trans healthcare providers of all sorts and medical associations to see what programs, if any, are available to support providers in learning about trans health and also uplifting queer providers as well. I also hope to gather stories from people of various socioeconomic backgrounds and races in order to exemplify how intersectionality influences people's experiences and to further highlight that people's family building journeys are not monolithic. So through this experience, I've really come to appreciate the time that it takes to forge connections in order to tell the stories that, as Tristan told me, likely wouldn't be told otherwise. So I want to leave you with a quote from Adam, who told me that no matter how you identify, the desire and love to want to start a family is universal, and all of us are working with what we have, whether that's finances or the support of biology to make a family. And sometimes that is done in a quote unquote unconventional manner, but it doesn't make them any less valid and doesn't make the journey any less real. I hope that everyone can just see that a family is a family. And that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing those stories with us, Rachel. And finally, we'll turn to our final presenter for this panel, Ruby Zhao.
Hello, everyone. My name is Ruby Zhao, and I am a sophomore at Davidson College. I use she, her pronouns, and I am majoring in English literature. And I am truly honored to be here today to discuss my ongoing project about World War II sex slaves. And today I will be presenting on preserving the story of Japanese sex slaves. Oops. So initially I was going to give a brief overview of the Second Sino-Japanese War, but I realized that I wouldn't have time for that. So if we do have time, I can come back to it. Oh yeah, there's also a trigger warning because I use pictures and they are extremely unnerving, so please be aware. So this section is about the Japanese war crimes committed against the Chinese and in general, most of the neighboring Asian countries. The list of crimes against humanity committed by the Japanese army is appallingly long, and I'll briefly talk about a few of them and go a little bit more in depth about the sexual enslavement of girls and women. The first one is Unit 731, which was a research institution that used lethal human experimentation. And the Japanese would perform surgical operations or dissect victims without anesthesia after injecting them or infecting them with diseases. And they removed organs, amputated limbs, and used Chinese prisoners of war and civilians to test their biological, chemical, and even military equipment weaponry. Majority of these experiments ended in the victim's death. And the second picture is the Nanjing Massacre, or Rape of Nanjing. Once Japanese forces captured the then capital of China, Nanjing, the Japanese forces murdered and raped disarmed combatants and unarmed civilians. And there was a death toll estimate of 50,000 to 300,000. And the picture here is only a fraction of the people who were killed in the massacre. And the third picture is a young Chinese girl who was forced into sexual slavery by the Japanese. I believe this was taken after Allied forces came to free her. These victims were euphemistically called comfort women. And I personally hate using the phrase, but if I do use it, it's because the few people that might have learned about it in school learned the history calling them that. And the Japanese army would abduct girls and young women from their homes and force them to work in military brothels. And most of these victims were 11 to 19-year-olds. And I remember there was even a survivor that was kidnapped at 8 years old. So in addition to kidnapping, there were instances where the troops would lure these girls by falsely advertising factory work, restaurants, and nursing jobs, only for them to be captured by the army and coerced into sexual enslavement. These women and children were raped daily and lived in awful conditions. So their stories have only just surfaced at the end of the 20th century. As you and I can imagine, it's extremely difficult to talk about rape because you realize that even in America, but especially in a Confucius society like China, telling people about rape is a taboo. And it often feels like the victim is wrong, and many of the survivors lived in poverty and were shunned from society. And it's incredibly heartbreaking. And on top of that, they have to deal with how emotionally draining it is to share their story. They essentially have to relive their trauma. And I understand why it took them so long to begin sharing their stories. So with this background, I will be now tackling the very basic premise of why I'm reporting on this topic. So I want to first address how I became inspired in embarking upon this journey. So on my personal side, this all began because I bonded with my father through watching like World War II documentaries that focused on the Second Sino-Japanese War. And as I grew older and began to expand on my knowledge, I noticed that in all of my high school's history textbooks, I could barely learn about the Second Sino-Japanese War. And there were perhaps like a few pages at most that were dedicated to the different roles that Asian allies in Japanese occupied countries had in the war. And the World War II chapters were primarily about America's pivotal role in ending the war. And because I had previous exposure to the history of the Second Sino-Japanese War, I noticed that only a portion of Japan's war crimes were mentioned. And the textbooks always seem like they told a fragmented and incomplete story that doesn't really give the full picture of how and why so many people suffered and died as a result of the war. So as a woman myself and being conscious of my identity and my Chinese background that surrounds it, I want to focus on sexual enslavement by the Japanese Imperial Army after reading about the rape of Nanjing. As I began to read about the testimonies and watch documentaries about how disgusting the sexual enslavement was, I also started to notice this narrative that kept popping up about how they were simply prostitutes and no coercion was involved from the Japanese side. This was mainly coming from Japanese nationalist sentiments, and this complete and utter denial of history is something I didn't think I would see in the present day, but clearly there is historical negationism like with the Holocaust. Japan has begun to erase this part of history from the textbooks, and some politicians even say that these women were willing participants. It's not only offensive, but extremely irresponsible on Japan's part. And I think the main reason why there is a push for textbook reform in Japan is that they recognize that history is fundamental in forming the national identity of the future generation leaders. However, I think organizations such as the Japanese Society for History textbook reform are going about it in the wrong way, in that what they're promoting is like an ultra nationalistic view of their history, which creates ignorant individuals that will be irresponsible leaders of the country. I think history is important because it gives us the opportunity to reflect on past mistakes and choices that should never occur again. And the fact that Japan is so hesitant worries me about the future and what it means to be a sexual assault victim. And many historians have paralleled the war crimes of Japan, the Holocaust, even though they can't be placed on the same level because they're separate. But the comparison on how country like Japan and Germany has handled the situation is completely different. So initially, my project was going to be an article interviewing survivors so I can contribute to cementing the history of comfort women and uncover stories that have yet to be told. However, because of the pandemic and ultimately China's more rigid restrictions on entry, especially for US citizens, I wasn't able to go. I had to move my project completely remote, and I changed the scope and lens of my story from focusing on the survivors' narrative to the conservation efforts put forth to preserve their stories. And I've interviewed two inspiring individuals, one being the first researcher of Chinese comfort women, Mr. Zhang Shuangbing, and the first Asian American woman judge in North California, the Honorable Judge Lillian Singh. Both individuals were incredibly welcoming and helpful in learning about the history and the current dialogue around the survivors' narratives. But because of time constraints, I'll just be talking about Lillian Singh's part. To be perfectly honest with you, it's quite daunting to interview such an esteemed individual, and I would often catch myself just being in awe of what Honorable Judge Singh has done for these survivors. So a little bit about her is that she did it. I'm sorry. She is the co-chair of the Comfort Women Justice Coalition, and the work the organization has done is incredibly fascinating. She was also involved in erecting a monument for survivors in San Francisco. There was a lot of controversy surrounding this monument, and it came from both Japan, but also surprisingly America. You would think that America, a country that prides itself on the fact that it is free, equal, and justice-seeking, whatever, would be extremely receptive towards this kind of memorial. But the root cause is usually the pressures that the Japanese government places on these monuments. In the case of San Francisco, the mayor of Osaka actually terminated the sister city relationship with San Francisco because of this monument. So clearly political issues are certainly in play. And I had actually asked Honorable Judge Singh why Japan is allowed to continue doing this. And it really boils down to politics and how these war crimes are concealed, because Japan is ultimately the only stable ally in Asia, and it was a buffer between China, a communist country, and the United States during the Cold War. So this complicity by the United States is continuously perpetuated. I asked her why Honorable Julie Tang and herself founded the Comfort Women Justice Coalition, despite how much controversy there was surrounding this. And she directed me to the inscription on the monument, which reads, and I quote, our worst fear is that our painful history during World War II will be forgotten, end quote. The memorial is dedicated to the memory of these women and to eradicating sexual violence and sex trafficking throughout the world. And I'm sure you can see why and how history is so important in progressing towards the future. I was at the second panel this morning, and I'm sure many of you were, and I just wanted to echo what Mr. Martin said on how we need to understand history to understand our present and our future. So as the chair of the coalition, she's worked tirelessly to, as I mentioned before, erect the Comfort Women statue, and is now working on 2 other projects. So one of her goals is for the public schools of San Francisco to include the history of these survivors in the curriculum for grades 10 and up. It has been passed, and now she's working with the California Board of Education to do the same, but instead expanding it to statewide. As she does this, and she is in the process of creating a pamphlet that will help teachers learn about and teach the history of these survivors, because oftentimes the teachers themselves haven't even been educated on this topic. And her other project is called Eternal Testimony, which is a partnership with the Shoah Foundation, which also deals with the Holocaust Museum and Nanjing Museum, to record and create an interactive experience where you can ask the survivor questions and they will answer it through pre-recorded video interviews. And I think this is incredibly important because it'll keep their stories alive even when they passed away. So in terms of where I am right now, I have completed my interviews that are geared towards preserving the survivors' memories, and I am waiting on interviews for the opposing side, I guess would be what it's called, which are like the Japanese officials who are rather slow at responding. And I feel like they might be giving me excuses, but who knows? And I will also be contacting Japanese scholars. And I personally believe that their narrative is a little troubling, but I'll get into that later. But as for my multimedia piece, I have completed a painting called In the Morning. So like instead of like morning time, it's morning, which is a commentary on how Japan is trying to silence these victims of sexual assault and how victims of rape are often silenced. And I will talk more about this in my artist statement, but the hands are collages made out of Japanese newspapers, and the shadows and gradient are supposed to symbolize a slow and steady hope that the future will allow us to speak freely and learn about the history and destigmatize sexual assault. And that is all I have. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much to all of our presenters today. The breadth and depth of your work and the amount of care that each of you put into interviewing and really capturing such complex and difficult stories is truly incredible. And so we do have time, I believe, for questions. So I will go ahead and let anyone in the chat just write down your name if you'd like to ask a question, and I'll let any fellows ask questions first. And if any of the fellows who presented have questions for each other.
I actually have a question.
Go ahead, Audrey.
So my question is for Ren. How did you juggle, like, how did you approach those harder interviews that were more about sensitive subjects? Because when I find myself reporting on sensitive subjects, I don't want the person to feel like I'm trying to get all up in their business. But for your kind of story, like, you do have to touch on those topics. So did you ease them into the topics? Were they prepared to talk about the harder things? Like, what was your approach?
So when I was setting up interviews, and again, like teenagers, it's a little bit different because I had long conversations with their parents, and then their parents talked to them a lot about what they would be comfortable talking about. But I was never the person who brought those issues up directly. I would ask questions. I asked questions that were more broad. Like I would ask, okay, like in school, you know, you talked a little bit about bullying. Like how long did that experience go on, or like what effects did that have on you? And then that's something that they would slowly bring out themselves. It took a lot of those conversations were very long. And I also, you know, like when they were feeling uncomfortable, I would let them stop. You know, we could change. I would just say, like, do you want to change the subject? And we would. And I also, like, I shared a little bit of what I'd been through, because I'm lucky not to have experienced that much like bad discrimination, but I've had lots of mental health issues. So I used like personal experiences to connect with them, and just made sure that no matter who they were, to give them time. And if I didn't end up getting it from them, I didn't push too hard, because I knew that if I pushed, I wouldn't only break like any trust I had with the source, but I would make them feel uncomfortable and possibly like trigger them emotionally. And I don't want my story to do that. So, and there were some things that they talked about that were really serious that I didn't cover. And I'm not putting into my article. Like I could, like I'm totally in my right to, but there are some things that I know that they would like to keep to themselves. So it was just that was sort of the process of like what that looked like, if that helps. And I actually had a question for you. This one's really quick. I was just wondering about like one thing that I've seen in like quite a few places, especially where like education about menstruation comes a lot later, is a stigma against tampons for fear of like losing virginity. And I was wondering if that's something that ever came up. It was something I was kind of curious about when you were speaking.
Yeah, actually, that never came up in my reporting. I had trouble finding sources. Like it wasn't like I had just an endless wealth of sources, especially on the younger end of the spectrum, because a lot of parents aren't comfortable with you talking to their kids about this stuff. Puerto Rico is very conservative. So no, I actually didn't come into that, but I might ask my sources about if they've heard a lot about that. In the workshops I did attend at the menstrual exhibition, they did talk about like condoms and different types of birth control. Like they were comfortable talking about the more mainstream stuff that actually didn't come up. So that's a good thing to look into. I'm gonna write that down. I'll get back to you if I hear anything.
Yeah, I know my my stepmother is Filipina, and she's talked about that a lot because she's like grew up in a very Catholic, very conservative area. So that was just something I was curious about. And also when I was in I've traveled to Japan, and it's nearly impossible to find tampons there. So yeah.
I would say that like culturally it's like they're available at Walgreens, they're available everywhere, like pads, and like everywhere I mean the like major chains in the cities. I just don't know like culturally what quote unquote reputation they have, like if there's a stigma against them, because I'm from San Juan. So there was a lot I had to learn about the rural parts of the city in my reporting, because I'm coming into this with a city point of view. So that's one thing I had to learn, was like what it's like in rural areas. So I can't answer your question in terms of the rural areas, but yeah, you can find them at the store, at least in San Juan, but I will get back to you on that.
Thank you both. And it sounds like Dustin has a question.
Yeah, hi everyone. So this was for Ruby, and I sent it to her so she could think about it for a minute ahead of time. But Ruby, you mentioned that all of the Japanese war crimes and crimes against humanity were brought to light recently, in the late 20th century. Has the government ever made a public statement or an apology, or were there any reparations that came from that?
So what I was actually talking about was the comfort woman narratives that were coming into light in the late 20th century. The war crimes were talked about once they were like committed, because there was actually documentation. The documentation for comfort woman was a lot less sparse, and I think they destroyed them all. But there is, Japan has made a lot of public statements and apologies towards these war crimes. However, there has been increasing sentiments from politicians saying that this isn't actually the history, and they're like beginning to change the narrative. I think it kind of started with the former Prime Minister Abe. So.
Thank you.
Again, feel free to put your name in the chat if you have any questions, but I will begin asking questions because I have many for you all. I'm wondering if Callie might talk about the photographer you connected with for this project and how you found that person.
Yeah, they're actually a graduate student at SIU as well, so we just knew each other through that. And they just couldn't be here today, but they were a full partner on the project, and they took a lot of photos for it.
Awesome. Ren, are you putting your name in the chat to ask a question?
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. You can go ahead.
Okay, this question was for Ruby, and it's about a little bit of the historical revisionism. So, and again, this is more from my personal experience, but when I traveled to Japan, I was at like the Meiji Shrine, and they had a timeline of Japan's history, and it stopped at 1930 and then started up again in 1947. And just the entire, like, they covered everything else in depth, but that period of time, it was completely wiped. And I was wondering, do you think that that's a general issue in Japan right now? Do you think that, and that the comfort women, like, denial, and I hate that term, that denial is kind of emblematic of a greater wish to eradicate the uncomfortable parts of history?
I think you said it perfectly. There has been this increasing like nationalist sentiment amongst politicians saying that these women were prostitutes and they went willingly, and that's a really big problem. And even the Nanjing massacre, they have been disputing the numbers, and they've like tried to lower or diminish how much people they murdered.
Rachel, I'm curious if you could speak a little bit about the geographic distribution of your reporting thus far, and where you're hoping you might get additional sources or reporting going forward.
Sure. Yeah. So reporting virtually, I went into this story not having a specific location that I was focused on, because I think it really was dependent on who I could kind of get to talk to me at the beginning, and I knew it would maybe be easier as I met that first person. And so I'm seeing through my reporting now that obviously, like in cities and places like San Francisco, obviously, like the healthcare there is very like queer accepting, and they have a lot of research around that as well. And Adam, funny enough, is actually moving to Portland, where Tristan is currently living. So I think we're seeing the shift to cities that are more inclusive and diverse. And like Adam said, he wants Miles to grow up around people that are around families that are like theirs, and that even in the Bay Area, he doesn't feel enough of that. So that's really interesting, and I think I could maybe look into specific places like Portland in the future of my reporting, but I think maybe I'll find a specific route as well in looking at medical providers, because I haven't quite gotten into that yet, looking at queer providers. So I think that might also give me a way forward.
Awesome, thank you. Yes, Ken. Oh, you're muted though.
Okay, I wanted to follow up on something Ren said about protecting the privacy and the confidentiality of some of the people that you talked to, Ren. And I think that's so important to keep in mind with all of the subjects that everybody on this Zoom is reporting on. And you can think about, you know, what somebody has told you and what you have a right to say. But in the case of interviewing people who are not powerful politicians, but, you know, people who come from communities that are underreported and people who lead private lives, I think the standard is different, and you do think about causing no harm when you interview, not so much, you know, of course, when you interview them, but when you quote them and when you use their names in stories. So, you know, just keep that in mind. It's different if it's somebody who is chosen to be a public person, somebody who's a politician, and there are, you know, policy issues involved. But if it's someone's inner life and, you know, their personal feelings and experiences, you want to be careful about what they say. And especially also, of course, with people who are teenagers who may, you know, not realize the consequences of what they're saying. So just, I've also found, and I've told some of you this already, that, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, editors were, we are not going to quote you unless you can use the first name and the last name, the age and the occupation. No quotes unless you identify who's speaking. That has changed for especially, I'm talking about people who are not public personas. So we read this in the story now, in stories now all the times, and even like the New York Times, which was very strict about it. People are being more careful about protecting their sources. And sometimes you see a first name and then followed by who prefers not to give a last name, something like that. So just something to keep in mind.
Yeah, that's actually with there was only one source who didn't want to have their last name used, and he'd actually had his last name used in previous articles before, but he had become increasingly uncomfortable over time. And so there were two different options, is one was a fake last name and one was no last name at all. And I went with no last name just because I don't obviously someone probably doesn't have that name, but if they did, people might look it up. So.
Right. I mean, that's
Yeah.
an option you have and something that you'll discuss with your editor. And you have to be willing to share the name with the editor. And the editor has a right to ask you for the full name, but you need to explain to the editor that you don't want to use the full name. And if they don't respect it, then move on to another editor. Are there more questions?
I had a final question, unless anyone else would like to take that spot. Which is just, I'm curious how the process of the reporting fellowship has either inspired the work that you want to do going forward, or other just interest areas that you now have that you maybe weren't expecting when you began the project.
So my experience is maybe a little different, but it made me more aware. Doing the project made me more aware of what I can cover, but it also made me much more distinctly aware of my inability to do that right now. I could probably do freelance work, but the paper that I work at is far too small. My editor would be totally fine with it, but the issue, unfortunately, the issue is advertising. Our paper is so small that we can't afford to do something like that, and it really sucks. But yeah, it definitely made me a lot more aware that I want to be able to do these kind of stories. And so I'm working out something with my editor to do long form stories that I pitch other places, in addition to the work that I already do for the two papers that I write for.
I can
Yeah,
jump
I
in.
mean, my experience is having an experience in broadcast news, which is, very, very fast paced, which is actually why I left it, because I needed more time. The stories I wanted to tell required more time, required more commitment, required more integrity. And that doesn't always happen in broadcast news. So this experience is just reaffirming what I thought I knew. The fact that, and I actually see it having another experience. So I think it seems still a bit as a luxury, as it's going to end. Someone's going to tell me, no, you have to turn the story in tomorrow. We're going to publish it. We're going to air it, right? Having the freedom in a way, right, to say, no, wait a minute. Let me think about this. The confidentiality is a big issue for me. It's so huge, because whatever I'm going to publish in the story, I can't forget that even if it's published in the US, it will be seen and read in Greece, and these people are waiting on a bunch of things, right? So everything, all of our stories that we said here today have a direct impact on people's life. It's that serious. So it just reaffirmed that I have the time to stop and say, wait a minute, no, let me think about it. Let me talk about this. Let me have that space. Okay, maybe too much, right? Because of COVID and all, too much. But that I know that if I need to exchange some thoughts, and it's going to be happening more and more. Sorry, I know I can reach out to, right, to the Pulitzer Center. I know I'll be able to talk to a journalist come before I go on my reporting trip. All that doesn't exist in the life that I had as, you know, as a professional journalist. I didn't have that luxury, and I really kind of see it as a luxury for me. So it just reaffirmed that this is exactly what I should be doing.
And Adriana, before you also answer, we have to take a very quick photo. So if anyone who's available to turn on their video for a quick photo, I'll give you a few seconds to do so. And then I will take a picture in 3, 2, one more. Oh, someone just came. Hold on, it's 3, 2, 1. Thank you all so much. And then Adriana, you were about to share something maybe, so just to make sure we got to.
Yeah, I'll be brief because I know we're running out of time. I was just going to say that this reporting project made me realize that it's so much easier to write when you care about the topic or when you have a connection to the topic. I work at my city's newspaper, and sometimes I get thrown assignments that are the hardest stories to write, even if it's just a 400 or 500 word article, because I don't necessarily have an interest in it. I'm just being assigned the story. So it just made me really value my own pitches.
Well, before we wrap up, I just want to encourage all of you to come to the sessions tomorrow, but in particular, the 1 o'clock session, which will be the wrap up. So hope to see you all there. And Catherine, are you the host for this? Or
I am the host.
Oh, okay. Can you leave it on? Because I think I'm going to talk to Ruby afterwards.
Yes.
Okay, thanks. Kayla, I'll leave it to you now.
Thank you all so much. I really, really just want to thank you each for presenting today and for sharing such amazing, incredible stories and your work so far. And for those of you who have not published, we are very much looking forward to when we can read and watch your stories. And as Kem just said a moment ago, please join us for the next session, which will be tomorrow morning. You're welcome to join even if you have not signed up. The session will begin at 10 a.m. and the reporting project themes will be justice and human rights in one session, and the second will be all things health. I just want to tell you all to please enjoy your evening. And as a reminder, you have dinner vouchers, which you could use tonight, or as Libby said, 3 months from now, if you would prefer. And with that, have a good evening. Thank you all for joining us again.